Well, it's my privilege to introduce our speaker today. He may or may not be a stranger to you. If you know anything about youth ministry, you should recognize this man's name. He is not infamous, but I think he's famous in terms of youth ministry. And he is currently professor of ministry at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, not far from where I grew up, actually. In fact, kind of weird connections with Duffy. Almost every member of my family attended Grove City College. It's kind of weird. In fact, my uncle is on the board of Grove City College. Kind of weird. But he's a respected youth ministry veteran with over 40 years of experience in the field. He speaks around the world to teenagers and people who care about teenagers. Duffy also serves as a teaching pastor at Faith Bridge Church in Spring, Texas. Now, if you're thinking, Grove City, Pennsylvania, Springtown. I'll let you try to explain that, maybe. He's the author of numerous books, including Ministry of Nurture, This Way to Youth Ministry, An Introduction to the Adventure, Speaking to Teenagers, also authored with Doug Fields, Enjoy the Silence, authored with his lovely wife, Maggie, and his latest book, Building a Youth Ministry That Builds Disciples. Now, we have Duffy in chapel this morning and also tomorrow, but two other quick announcements related to that. We're having a brown bag today and tomorrow, right after chapel. The first 20 of you that show up are going to get a free box lunch. How's that for bribery? So we'll be in Campbell 203 upstairs right after chapel to spend an hour just interacting with Duffy and asking him questions and picking his brain a little bit. And then announcement also Wednesday night at First Baptist Church, Dallas at 6 p.m. It's anybody can come for free parent seminar. He's going to be talking to parents and to folks that deal with teenagers and raise teenagers about that incredible task. So invite all of you, any of you that would like to attend that as well on Wednesday night at First Baptist Church. Without further ado, come on up here and speak to us, Dr. Duffy Robbins.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you so much, and thanks just for letting me be with you this morning. It was great, and I especially appreciate the chapel music. That was excellent. Patrick and Kivas and Josh, thanks so much for leading us. That was Patrick. He does that keyboard thing. He plays the same songs, but they don't sound the same. And he said, "Yeah, I like to put some sauce on it." So I like that. I like that. If you can't find sauce anywhere, you ought to be able to find it in Dallas, Texas. It's a good thing. And thank you, too, Jay, for that introduction. I hope you will be able to join us tomorrow night at First Baptist Parent Seminar. I'm a little concerned about the attendance there because that's the only thing I've heard announced this morning where there's not any bribery. And we're really just counting on people that love teenagers. So yeah, there's no food, but it should be a good thing. Thank you, Jay, for the intro. That was very gracious. I know that, or I was thinking to myself that when you hear this is youth chapel, today and tomorrow, and we're going to focus on youth ministry, and then this elderly dude stands up. It's not funny. Wait a minute, we could be here some great Bible teaching. I got up here early. I could be studying. This is a youth chapel. And I was just thinking to myself, you're probably thinking to yourself, this better be good. So I want us to talk this morning about dealing with disappointment. Actually, I'll start off by, I want to begin, I don't know what you think about when you think about youth ministry, you think about teenagers. I know that for a lot of people, the very thought, the very idea of teenage spirituality just seems like an impossibility. That every now and then you'll hear, even youth pastors kind of huddle together and talk about teenage disciples the way people talk about sightings of Sasquatch and there was one sighted at the Baptist and it's funny because a lot of people just think those two words pretty much cancel each other out. That teenage, it's like there is a comedian. I think it's Stephen. Correct me if I'm actually. Never correct me. But I think there's a guy named Stephen Wright who does a whole comedy routine based on oxymorons. And we all remember the oxymoron from high school English, two words in juxtaposition that appear to be in apparent contradiction. And anyways, this whole comedy routine of words like that and phrases like that. You were nodding your head. Give me a good oxymoron. Can you think of a good... Okay, Jumbo Shrimp. What was yours? Led Zeppelin. Did you say Led Zeppelin? Let's just pray for that brother. It's really serious. Patrick sauce, dude. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of those that you hear in everyday life, right? Like there's Civil War, Fun Run, and right. I mean, I don't get that one. Microsoft Works. Yeah, one of my favorites is United Methodist, but you kind of hear these, wait a minute, those two words don't belong together. And I think there are a lot of people that when they hear the terms teenage spirituality, they think of them as almost oxymoronic. They don't really belong together. Years ago, Youth Specialties, probably one of the largest youth ministry resourcing companies in the world, used to publish a magazine called Youth Worker Journal, published it for over 20 years. And one of the very last columns in Youth Worker Journal, it was written by Youth Specialties founder Mike Yaconelli, was an article in which he actually made a statement that was pretty controversial. He said, "I don't believe in student discipleship. I don't believe in student discipleship." But here's the guy that founded this massive youth ministry resourcing company called Youth Specialties, and he basically says, "I don't believe in student discipleship," because he says essentially teenagers are too young to be disciples. And I remember when I read it, I mean, Yaconelli and I, we worked very closely. I've worked with youth specialties for years, and I was kind of stunned. And a bunch of us, were calling each other and saying, "What's Yaconelli doing?" And he was kind of known for the, kind of provocative language and stuff. But I mean, this kind of is crazy when you're a guy that basically is publishing material to help people disciple teenagers. It doesn't seem like, why would you say there's no such, it's like I said to Yaconelli, I said, that's like a pimp leading a True Love Weights rally. I mean, when you say stuff like that, it's a little bit counterproductive. If I'm a youth worker out there and I hear someone who's supposed to be sort of an advocate for youth ministry saying there's no such thing as youth ministry or youth discipleship, you get discouraged. And yet I remember back early on in 1986, one of the very first issues of Youth Worker Journal, there was a quote by Gordon MacDonald, prolific writer, years and years and years of pastoral experience, in which he actually said genuine commitment doesn't happen during the teenage years. Genuine commitment doesn't happen during the teenage years. And I suspect, standing here this morning, that there are probably some of us in the room that wonder, can it really be? Is there really any such thing as genuine student discipleship? And others of us who go, yes, there are. And others of us who want to believe there is such a thing as student discipleship. Let's be honest, even we sometimes wonder, can God really do this in the lives of that kid? And so what I'd like to do today and tomorrow is share with you some lessons that I've learned about discipleship by doing student ministry. And it's going to be kind of a combination, I think, of hopefully meditation on the Word, but also sort of exploring the idea of spiritual growth. And probably as we walk through here, there'll also be a word of testimony and my own experience in life and ministry. I'm going to share with you these principles in terms of what I would call sort of an axiom. And I like to use the word axiom because in the dictionary, axiom is defined as a widely accepted maxim, an idea that's accepted on its merit. These are principles that are actually anchored in Scripture, but they're also testified to in the everyday life of a person who's been doing youth ministry for many, many years. So as we think about these, I want you to think about them as principles that sort of form the frame of how we might imagine what does it look like to be a teenage disciple, and is it really even possible that there is such a thing? So that's kind of the game plan for today and tomorrow. Let's start this morning with the first of these principles, which I call the baby step principle. The baby step principle. There was a movie that came out probably 20 years ago now. I don't remember. It was a movie. Bill Murray is one of the stars. Richard Dreyfuss was in it. But it was the movie called What About Bob? Anybody see that? Oh, you saw it, Joe? Okay. Yeah, it was rated R. And in that movie, it was It's troubling. And anyway, in that film, Bill Murray played the part of this guy that was agoraphobic. He was afraid to go out in public. And if you saw it, you know what happens. He went to see his psychiatrist, who was played by Richard Dreyfuss. He walks into the office, and Dreyfuss is sitting there, smug and all-knowing. And they talk for about an hour, and it's been helpful. And now it's time for this thing to conclude. And at the end of the appointment, Richard Dreyfuss's character sort of drops a bomb on Bob and says, Bob, listen, I want you to know that me and my family are going to go away on vacation. And we're going to be away for a month. And it would be inappropriate for you to make contact with me while we are away. And of course, this just sends Bob into absolute turmoil, because what's he going to do? And just in the midst of his panic, Richard Dreyfuss's character goes over to the bookshelf and takes off of the shelf a book that he himself has written. And the name of the book, well, anybody remember the name of the book? Anybody saw the movie? Yeah, what? Yeah, Baby Steps, Baby Steps. And the idea behind the book is that you don't work your way to wholeness by taking giant steps. You work your way to wholeness by taking baby steps. Probably one of the most basic principles I've learned about spiritual formation, about discipleship, and particularly about discipling teenagers is this: that true spirituality requires a giant step of faith, but it's almost always marked by short steps of obedience. Why is this important to think about? One of the reasons I really like to kind of begin here is because I think a lot of times when people think about teenage discipleship, stereotypically we tend to think of that moment, the last night of camp, and everybody's around the fire. And these kids are kind of staring into the blaze, their faces kind of reflecting the orange and the yellow, and sparks shooting up in this pristine nighttime sky. It's the last night of camp at Camp Awesome, and it's just holy solemnity. And somebody stands up, maybe you, maybe me, but somebody stands up and says, young people, I'm going to ask you to do something right now. I'm going to ask, if you're serious about Jesus, to come up here and stand with me next to this campfire. Or if you're really serious about Jesus, I'm going to ask you to come up here right now and throw a piece of wood into the fire. Or if you're really serious, and this is not going to be easy. If you're really serious about Jesus, I'm just going to ask you to come up here right now, one at a time. Just stand in this campfire, and people do it, and kids responding, "Oh my gosh, that's fantastic!" And it is fantastic. Please understand, I love those moments at the fire. I love those big giant steps of commitment. But anybody who's been in ministry more than about 20 minutes will tell you that the test of what happens at that fire is what happens when that fire burns out. Is there still a passion? That's the mark that we see. I'm convinced that's part of what attracted and intrigued Moses when he sees this bush that is burning, but it's not consumed. Well, there was actually a relatively large youth ministry movement over the last several years. They kind of stopped about 5 years ago, but they used to have this big, huge thing called the Choir of the Fire. And they would have like 15, 20,000 kids, in an auditorium. And I appreciate what happened there, what God did through that. But here's my experience in ministry. Is it's not that hard to get people to acquire the fire. What's hard is getting people to sustain the fire. That doesn't happen through giant steps. That happens through baby steps. Little by little baby steps. I'm struck that Paul, when he talks to the Colossians about their own growth, he says, as you receive Christ Jesus as Lord, Colossians chapter 2, so walk in him. And then look at verse 7. Having been firmly rooted and now being built up in him and established in your faith, just as you were instructed, and overflowing with gratitude. He uses two metaphors in verse 7. One is an agricultural metaphor. The other is an architectural metaphor. But both of them point to long-term processes. But one of the reasons I think we get discouraged, we get disenchanted and just worried about teenage discipleship and can it really happen is because we sort of measure it by the giant steps. God measures spiritual growth by baby steps. It's the baby steps of commitment. You see this in Paul's life, Philippians 3. He says, look, I don't claim I've already attained all this, that I've already gained perfection. But one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind, straining to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. One of my literary mentors, as I'm sure for you, is Oswald Chambers. And I don't know how many times I've read through My Utmost for His Highest. And Oswald Chambers has some great stuff on this. And one of my favorite quotes from My Utmost is this. He says, "There's no thrill in walking. It is the test of all the stable qualities. To walk and not faint is the highest reach possible for strength. When we're in an unhealthy state, physically or emotionally, we always want thrills. We're looking for the giant steps. But in the physical domain, this is going to lead to counterfeiting the Holy Ghost. In the emotional life, it leads to inordinate affection and the destruction of morality. And in the spiritual domain, if we insist on getting thrills, on mounting up with wings, it will end in the destruction of spirituality." What I've learned about discipleship and working with teenagers is not to get too pumped, not get too psyched about the giant step. That in my own ministry, I want to focus less on the how many come forward and focus more on the how many press onward. It's not about the giant steps. It's about the baby steps of commitment. That's the baby step principle. Let's talk about a second principle. A second principle that I want to mention this morning is what I call the Tarzan principle. The Tarzan principle. When I was a little boy, Tarzan was unashamedly my hero. I love Tarzan. I mean, I love the fact that he lived in Africa. I thought that was cool. I love the fact that he got to wear that, kind of leopard skin tankini. I thought that was cool. In fact, I remember I wanted to wear one Halloween, and my wife said, "No, you'll frighten the children." But that was pretty cool. And then of course I love the fact that that he could talk to the animals. I just remember that was great. And I like the fact that he could swing on vines. I remember a lot of times getting off the bus at the stop and just go, "Man, wouldn't it be awesome just to swing on back to the house?" And then of course the best thing about Tarzan, you remember this, I'm sure, is that classic trademark Tarzan yell, right? How many? And I'm not going to embarrass him. How many think you can do a good Tarzan? Just put your hand up. You think you can do a good Tarzan? Okay, 2 people. Yeah, it surprised me. I would have thought in a DTS chapel we'd have a huge number. Well, I tell you what, let's do. Just on the count of 3, let's just give it a shot, all right? And if you want to pound your chest, feel free. 1, 2, 3. You said you couldn't. Good. I actually did it because I'm pretty good at it, but the last time I did it, a couple of giraffes showed up. But I love that. And of course, Tarzan would do that yell partially to communicate with animals, and partially because sometimes that leopard skin thing would get caught in the vine. But the thing that used to always kind of worry me a little bit about Tarzan is you remember how for Tarzan there was always a tree right where he needed it, right? And he would swing through the jungle and here comes another tree, there's another vine, and it was always loose and always precisely the right length. If it had been too short, too long, and it was always where he needed it. And I just, as a little boy, I used to have this kind of troubling recurring nightmare where I would imagine Tarzan, swinging through the jungle, treetop, into treetop, to treetop, to treetop. And then he'd come to a clearing. And I just imagine this blur of flesh and leopard skin flailing and kind of crash landing and then surrounded by a bunch of laughing primates. And I think about that sometimes when I think about youth ministry, because I think if we're not careful in youth ministry times, and let's be honest, in ministry in general, if we're not careful, our zeal for the powerful can create what I call Tarzan Christianity. Tarzan Christianity is where we basically develop in people, breed in people a desire, an appetite for those moments in the treetops. When the view is spectacular, when you feel closer to God, when the air is cleaner and it's just fantastic and you go, wow, this is amazing, I love God. But then Monday, and you go back to work and you're back in the jungle and back to school, and all of a sudden that God that seems so near and so intimate doesn't seem so close anymore, and you just go, man, is what's going to? Well, wait a minute, here comes another Sunday, or the fall retreat, or the winter retreat, and we basically swing from treetop to treetop, but inevitably we have to go back into the jungle, and the jungle is a place of peril, and the jungle is where our enemy, the devil, roars like a prowling lion, and what happens is we sort of develop, I think, in young people, the way we do youth ministry, we can develop in them sort of this Tarzan Christianity where they try to live the Christian life from treetop moment to treetop moment to treetop moment. That's not discipleship. Discipleship, faith, if it's real, is faith that's real in the jungle of the everyday. And what that means, I think, in part, is that, yes, I do want to create amazing experiences. I do want to give my students those times, those treetop moments when they really do feel a clarity in their closeness with God and their presence of God. But I also want them to understand that Jesus is with them in the jungle. What we know, what Tarzan did not know, is that we have a Savior. John chapter 15, who says, I am the vine. You're the branches. Now that means we don't need to swing from treetop to treetop to treetop. We need to help our young people cling to the vine. The true spirituality, if we're going to understand genuine spiritual formation, it's about developing a faith that is real in the jungle, in between meetings, in between Sundays, in between Wednesday nights. This is real faith, a faith that clings to the vine, even in the jungle. Let me mention a third principle this morning. Real love principle, the real love principle. I'll be honest, I photoshopped that a little bit. But I remember I became a Christian in high school, and it was freshman year of college. It was my first year as a Christian, and it was my first Easter, and I grew up in North Carolina, and me and my buddies on Easter weekend, we always went to Myrtle Beach. And I remember, this first Good Friday as a Christian, walking down the beach by myself, because I was kind of trying to figure out, like, okay, this is different than our other beach trips. And I heard this music coming from the other side of the stage, the other side of the dunes, and it was these people set up on a stage, a flatbed truck out in the middle of this main drag there, right in front of this beer joint, and they were playing music. And it was an interracial group, and they were singing. And as I listened to them, I go, wow, they're talking about Jesus. And I was kind of amazed at that, because I'd never even heard of such a thing as Christian music. And then I saw these two girls in the group on stage, and I remember thinking to myself, I would like to share my faith with them. And I was just thinking, wow, this is truly amazing. And so I, after the concert, went over and started talking to this one girl. And anyway, we talked and stuff. And every time that group performed over the next 5 days over Easter weekend, I went to see them perform. And they did about 5 or 6 different concerts. Well, anyway, I went on. It took me about a month before I actually had a chance to date her. But over time, I just, I knew I would date this girl, so it took me about a month. I had to explain stuff to my fiance. But anyway, I ended up, I started dating this girl. I dated her for 3 years, married her, and here's what's interesting. Picture of the wedding. But here's what's interesting is that I actually told that girl, I spoke to that girl yesterday and told her how much I loved her. Well, I can remember the first time I loved her. I already knew. I'd been seeing her every time they'd play it. I'd go see them, and so I'd talk with her for about a month or so. I knew by our first date that I loved her, but I wasn't going to freak her out. Right? I don't want to tell her that. I waited till the next night and told her I loved her. And anyway, here's what I want you to understand. When I told her the first time that I loved her, I really meant it. And when I told her yesterday that I loved her, I really meant it. 49 years later. But here's what I want you to understand. Even though on both occasions, I really, really meant it. What I really, really meant when I meant it 49 years ago is a lot different from what I meant when I meant it yesterday. But that doesn't mean it wasn't genuine commitment. You see, the real love principle reminds us that they're really committed to Jesus may not look like you're really committed to Jesus, but that doesn't mean they're not really committed to Jesus. Of course, it means more now than it meant then. I've known them more than we've shared years of ministry together, raised kids together, we've laughed together, we've cried together, we've been through all kinds of adventures together. Of course, it means more now. One of the reasons I think people become sort of doubtful about the possibility of real life teenage discipleship is because somehow we're sort of evaluating what they mean when they say they're committed to Jesus about what we mean when we say we're committed to Jesus because they fall short. Of course it does. There's this progression of growth. I mean, think about, you and see it, for example, in 2 Peter. Make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. There is a progression in growth, just as there is a progression in physical growth. And one of the reasons I think we get discouraged sometimes with this idea of teenage discipleship is we think, no, it just can't be because their commitment doesn't look like our commitment. Let me just share with you one last principle this morning. I call it the morning sickness principle. The morning sickness principle. My wife and I had been married about 5 years, and that's when she contracted a very serious case of pregnancy. And of course, I was very excited about this and stuff, but the way I was made aware of this information was I came in one morning, and she didn't do anything cutesy. She didn't like put booties on my placemat, or Pampers on my pillow. She actually alerted me to this because I woke up one morning to the sound of her vomiting. And this is a little bit out of her normal routine. And so I, being a nurturing husband, I go in there to the bathroom. There she is on all fours in front of the toilet. And I said, I'm trying to sleep. I go in there, and I didn't even get a chance to speak. She spoke first. I didn't even get a chance to say a word. She simply looked up at me. This is where it became very from the toilet. And she had this look of splendor on her face as if she had seen New Testament scrolls floating. And she looked up and said, we're pregnant. And it's hard when you see your wife barfing her brains out. This is beautiful. I sure wasn't going to kiss her. But actually what she was saying is, hey, look, I get it. I understand what you think you see, but don't be fooled. Something stunning is unfolding right before our very eyes. God is doing something amazing. And in fact, I remember going through those 9 months of gestation and waiting. And then finally, the big night, I was a youth pastor up in Rhode Island, Barrington Baptist Church. And the big night, and okay, she said, we're ready to go. We go down to Women's and Infants Hospital in Providence. And, we go through the labor thing. And finally, the nurse comes in and says, okay, Mrs. Robbins, you are ready to birth this baby. We're going to take you into the labor suite. And I think, labor suite. Okay, we've been upgraded. And I don't know what you think. I hear labor suite, I think of kind of a nice, kind of a dimly lit room, a nice carpet, quiet, maybe a TV I can watch while she finishes up. And it just sounded delightful, Well, let me explain. The labor suite at Women's and Infants Hospital was essentially a wide hallway, not unlike the one right out there, in which women are lined up on gurneys, each of them separated by canvas curtains. And I don't know if the hospital was aware of this or not, but these curtains were not actually soundproof. And so we're in our stall kind of doing our breathing and everything, and I'm hearing just horrific sounds, just groans and shrieks, and I don't know what these women were giving birth to. I think some kind of geometric object, but all I know is I remember thinking to myself, holy cow. I could see it in Maggie's eyes. She was like, have we gotten to this part yet? And I don't think so. And it just struck me that if you just came from Mars, you just landed in the labor suite. You just dropped down in the labor suite. You go, this is horrific. This is ugly. This is horrible. And somebody goes, no, actually what you're witnessing are the sounds of new life being born. I think one of the reasons that sometimes we doubt God's power in the birthing process of teenage Christians is we forget that youth ministry is about being in the labor suite. There's some pushing, there's some blood, there's some shrieks, there's some screams. It's not always pretty. But remember what Paul said in Galatians 4:19? My children with whom I groan in labor until Christ is formed in you. I know what God can do in the lives of teenagers. Some of you are just those teenagers. I'm one of those teenagers. And I've begun to see that, yeah. Don't give up on the possibility, the power of this vision of what Jesus can do in the lives of teenagers. But understand, the process doesn't always look like progress. Thank you for listening. Hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.